Multiplayer Paradox Grand Strategy campaigns can take weeks or even months to complete. Then during those weeks and months, you and the other players need to be civil enough with each other so that you're not all miserable and wanting to rage quit at the first opportunity. Unfortunately, the alternative is all too common, and that's the situation where everyone's miserable, it's nothing but complaining, a good number of players have already rage quit, and the entire group is simply waiting and hoping for a new campaign to start as quickly as possible. A little over a week ago, I hosted a Filthy Casual stream during our normal game time, during which we discussed these issues and what we can do to address some of these problems. If you want to see the full discussion, I'll leave a link in the description. That's the Saturati Let's Fix MP stream. In this video, I'll be going over the conclusions that we reached, as well as some supporting examples and the reasoning behind them. Hello and welcome to the War Room number 29. Now, before we even get started, I'm going to address one bit of criticism, which is that many of the guidelines that we came up with as a group ask you, the individual, to not play at your full optimal capacity. That is, if it were single player, this is not how you would be playing. But this isn't single player, this is multiplayer. And the question you have to ask yourself is it worth it for me to be an optimal player if doing so is going to piss off other people to the point where they leave and ruin the game? I think the answer to that is no, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, which is why I'm asking you as an individual to dial it back a bit so the game as a whole will be improved. Okay, let's get started. The first category are the guidelines of things that you can do as an individual that will make the game better for everyone. And whether that's an action that you do or the way you approach the game doesn't matter. These aren't rules, these are guidelines. So the first guideline is be prepared to face the consequences of your actions. This is especially true if you've done something stupid, and it also means that if you do something stupid and then you pay the price for it, you shouldn't be rage quitting as a result of that. So how do you address this? Well, it's simple. Don't do something that you don't want to face the consequences of. This means that if you're playing Victoria 2 and you're playing as Russia and you spend an entire session annexing Sweden and going up to 150 infamy, don't start crying and rage quit when someone decides to contain you for it. If you're playing EU4 and you decide to take that extra province and it gives you a giant coalition, if you taking that one province causes a bunch of AI nations to form a coalition against you, you have only yourself to blame. You knew what the aggressive expansion was going to be for taking that province. Maybe you shouldn't have taken it. Maybe you should have waited a bit till your aggressive expansion wore down. But what you can't say as a player is that you were justified in taking it, and now that you've taken it, the fact that the coalition is fired means that you're justified in rage quitting. You don't get to ruin the game for everyone else. And when you rage quit, that's exactly what you do. Because all the diplomacy that's taken place goes out the window when you're no longer there to take part in it. Second guideline, be satisfied with less than 100% war score, which also means take less than 100% and be reasonable in your demands. When the standard is for wars to be decided with 100% war score imposed on either side, then it's all out war every single time you go to war. This is why these giant coalitions form. This is why the coalitions go to war. This is why every single war becomes a world war. It's because of the expectations. So let's limit our expectations a little bit. How about going for something that's less than 100%? Make some reasonable claims, declare war for the claims, and if the war flips around, how about return the favor? So that's the take home here. Be reasonable. Guideline number 3, and a lot of hardcore players are going to disagree with me on this, but here it is. Limit diplomacy to just before the session. I can't tell you how many times I've been messaged on Steam and on Discord in the days leading up to a session, and sometimes even weeks before a session, of people trying to work out diplomacy in advance. As, who are you playing? Who am I playing? Let's get an alliance going. Let's carve up this land together. If you expand this way, I'll expand that way, and, we'll be friends and whatnot. And again, this is days and weeks before the game is even started. And then once the game started, it's just constant. Every day you can expect to see Steam messages, someone trying to work out some treaty or some nonsense, right? And this is a case where, yes, if you're the person that's conducting this diplomacy behind the scenes, this benefits you enormously because you're going to come into the game, you're going to have all these deals worked out before anything's even happened. And I've even seen in Demian's multiplayer game, groups of like 3 and 4 setting the whole Discord servers up just so they can talk behind other people's backs. It's so unnecessary. And it doesn't contribute to the game in any way because what you're doing is circumventing the game itself. I already talked about how coalitions were a problem, right? Well, what you're doing in this case is essentially coming up with coalitions outside of the game itself. You've already determined who your allies are going to be, and you've already determined who your enemies are going to be. And that's before the game's even started. And then while the game's going, you're doing all this backdoor stuff, which is fine. I mean, I don't mind a little backstabbing here and there, but you're doing it outside the scope of the game itself. Well, you might say, well, everyone's got the same opportunity to do this, so why is it a problem? Well, here's why it's a problem. The people that are conducting this backdoor diplomacy are probably going to be the best players anyway. They have the most experience in multiplayer, they have the most experience in setting up these backroom deals, and they're the ones who are least likely to need the extra benefits that this diplomacy affords them. So, as an example, we start up a new Victoria 2 game. What's the first thing that happens? Everyone gets their country assigned to them. Instantly, people start talking to each other on Steam and Discord, coming up with backroom deals and forming coalitions, and that's before the game's even started. But who's excluded from this? The people who are excluded are the people that probably need the extra help the most. So that is, not the most experienced players, not the ones conducting the diplomacy, but the least experienced players, the ones that aren't so experienced in multiplayer, the ones who just showed up and this is their first campaign ever. They're the ones that lose out because they don't have everyone on Steam. They don't know all the other players. They don't have this history with everyone else that goes back months and years in the case of the people who do. So what happens? Some new player joins a group. Maybe they're not as experienced as the other players, but what happens? Well, all the other players are making backroom deals. And this new guy, well, he's not involved because he's the new guy. No one can trust him, right? So what happens? Session 1 comes along. Who's the guy that's going to get shit on? It's the new guy. Guess who's never coming back? Well, the new guy, the one you went out of your way to shit on. So the idea here is pretty simple. Don't make unfair backroom deals because it only benefits the players who don't need the help in the first place. Now, why do I say unfair backroom deals? Because am I saying don't ever make backroom deals? No, it's not what I'm saying at all. When you're in game, everyone's in the same place. Everyone's got their chat rooms and they can split off however they want. Of course, in game, you can message people and you can pick who you're messaging. This is a situation where everyone's on the same footing. So as an example, the new guy, well, you can actually make plans with him because he's in the game. Or if it's, say, 30 minutes before a session, and if everyone knows that 30 minutes before the session is the time for diplomacy, then everyone's going to be there, so no one gets left out. And it still might be the case where this new guy gets shit on, and that might just be the way that it works. But at least it's not completely unfair leading up to that point, right? People can reach out to this guy and say, hey, you're here, let's make some deals. Whereas before, they're not even included in the conversation. So that was Guideline 3. Limit your diplomacy to just before and, of course, during the session. Guideline number 4 is don't min-max against a role player. And there's a lot packed into this statement. Role players have a really bad reputation in some communities because they tend to not be the most effective at managing their nations. In some cases, it's because they're not as experienced players. In other cases, it's because their role-playing actually makes their nation not as strong as it would be otherwise. But whichever reason it is doesn't really matter because the fact that you're role-playing probably means that you're going to not do as well as someone who's min-maxing. So with all other things being equal, if you have a min-maxer against someone who isn't min-maxing, the min-maxer is almost guaranteed to win. But it's also the case that the min-maxer is going to look for easy targets. And who's an easier target than a role player? So the logical thing to do from a single-player multiplayer perspective is to wipe out the role players. Especially since if you want to have allies, do you want the min-maxer as your ally or do you want the role player as your ally? Well, if you're min-maxing, you probably want other min-maxers as allies. So again, the role player gets shit on. And as they have a bad time, they get fed up and then they leave the campaign. Well, this guideline is directed at the min-maxers, and I include myself in this because it's easy to go after less experienced players. But if all you're doing is going after the less experienced players and just pounding them until they leave the game, then you're making the game worse overall. So the general guideline is don't min-max against a role player, but another way to read that might be pick on someone your own size. Guideline number 5, which runs counter to what most people try to do in multiplayer grand strategy games. The idea that the more powerful you are, the less allies you should have, and that you as an individual should be more inclined to ally weaker players than stronger players. If you look back at the War Room 28, I already discussed how coalitions form, but basically they form around powerful nations. The powerful nations have allies, those allies ally each other, and all of a sudden you've got one group versus another, and every war becomes a world war. If the most powerful nations aren't allying every other nation that they possibly can, it means that those powerful nations have to support themselves, and it also means that less powerful nations can't just call on the more powerful nations to do their dirty work. Hello UK and Victoria 2, I'm looking at you. You should have 0-player allies every single game, until the balance of power shifts markedly in one direction or another, because you start out way too powerful. Now, we actually implemented a rule in Filthy Casuals to address this issue, and I'll be talking about that later when we talk about specific rules, but the general idea is that if you're powerful, you shouldn't rely on other people's help. Other people shouldn't be calling you in to do their dirty work. It also means that if you, as a powerful nation, have less allies, it means that other smaller nations allied to each other are more of a match for you, which I'm sorry to say might be unfortunate for you, especially if you're a min-maxer, but it is better for the game as a whole. Guideline number 6 is to support the underdog. And you can really interpret this any way you like, but basically it means try and preserve some sort of balance. So if you see one very powerful nation going against a less powerful nation, this might be your opportunity to hop into the defense of that less powerful nation. What it definitely doesn't mean is that you should be helping that more powerful nation rip apart the less powerful nation, because that makes the game worse for everyone. Let's try and keep that from happening from now on, and let's try and keep games a little bit more balanced. And one way you can do that, support the underdog, quit helping powerful nations that don't really need your help. And number 7, I'm just going to throw this in here, try to be somewhat fluid in your diplomacy. You know, the fact that nations get allied and then stay allied for the entire campaign, this is one reason leading to the formation of these coalitions. So you know what, you don't have to ally that nation. You can be friendly without allying. It doesn't mean you have to be enemies. When you ally, you know, that changes the diplomatic landscape quite a bit. So maybe don't ally unless you need to. You can still voice your support. You can ally and join a war when you need to, but it doesn't mean you have to stay allied the entire campaign. And along those same lines, let's try and dial back some of the offensive and defensive alliance treaties, because, let's face it, they don't really add anything to the game itself. They certainly don't add anything that can't be done within the game itself. So let's just try and dial that back a bit. So those are the guidelines that you as an individual can follow to make campaigns more enjoyable for everyone. But now I'm going to focus on a few rules that we came up with, and this is only going to apply to the Filthy Casuals, and some of these only apply to EU4 because that's what we've been mostly playing lately. Now the first rule, which goes along with the guideline of being reasonable in your war demands, is that you declare all of your goals when you declare war, and that any additional goals that you want to add have to be added one at a time during the war itself. And the reason for this is quite simple. The alternative is the case you see in more competitive Victoria 2 games where people declare war for something stupid, for example dismantle forts, when in reality what they're trying to do is get something completely different out of the war. So the idea here is that you declare war for your reasonable goals, you fight for those reasonable goals, and then you end the war. And if you want to add more war goals, and especially if you're winning the war, it gives the defense a chance to surrender to your goals at any given time. So as an example, if you declare war for 2 provinces, the defense could surrender. You can't suddenly add 100% on them, right? In another case, you declare war for 2 provinces, the war drags on, you decide you're going to add a 3rd province as a war goal. Well, the defense can now choose, are they going to surrender at this point, or are they going to keep fighting? Because if they keep fighting, there's the chance that you're going to keep adding war goals. If the defense happens to win the war, then they can add equivalent counter goals to begin with, but if the war turns around in a massive way, and now the defense is steamrolling the offense, then they'll have to do the same thing in reverse, which is they'll have to declare their counter goals and then add additional goals as the war goes on. This gives the attackers an opportunity to surrender and not get 100%ed. Our second rule is that for certain CBs, you only take war goals that are related to that CB. As an example, if you declare a reconquest war, you wouldn't be allowed to take land that isn't a core and covered by the CB. A third rule to prevent a gamey situation is that if you enforce peace on behalf of someone, that someone has to agree to your enforcing white peace. You can't enforce on behalf of someone that doesn't want you to enforce on behalf of them. The fourth rule goes along with guideline number 5, which is the idea that the more powerful you are, the less allies you should have. So the rule is that at regular intervals, players will be ranked according to how powerful they are, which in EU4 is going to be based on total income. The equivalent in Victoria 2 would probably be national rank. And the higher you are in the rankings, the less alliances and effective alliances you would be allowed to have. So as an example, if you're playing the Ottoman Empire in EU4, and if you have the highest income of any other player in the game, then you can have 1 effective alliance, whether that's an AI or a player. It means that no coalition can form around you because you only have 1 alliance that you can form. If you're the 2nd ranked player, you could have 2 effective alliances. If you're the 3rd ranked player, you could have 3, and so on down the list. Which means that the least powerful player has the most diplomatic options. It means that the most powerful player has to basically stand on their own, and can't simply become untouchable by virtue of all the alliances that they have. So things that are going to count as an effective alliance are obviously alliances, whether that's with a player or an AI, guaranteeing, sending Condotarati, enforcing peace, and perhaps some other related actions which we'll have to look into. Another EU4 specific rule is that if you perform a religious conversion, you're not allowed to do that if it causes you to lose more than 2 stability. And then the final rule is that you abide by peace terms. And the idea here is to expand the diplomacy in the game a bit. If you have a peace agreement with someone saying you will do this, that, or the other, and then you don't follow through with it, then you'll face appropriate consequences. But the basic idea here is to take treaties as they are used in other groups, boil them down to their essence, which is your agreement to do something on some condition, and then impose it on players who are in the game, minus all the jumbled legalese that people use to take advantage of less experienced players. That's the last of the new rules that we're adding. And finally, we're looking into making some mod edits of our own for our next EU4 campaign to address some of the issues that have come up in multiplayer. So some ideas that we had are that Loot Scare would give you aggressive expansion, which means that if you go for max looting in Mayo, then you could very likely get a coalition out of it as a result, which means that looting players into the ground is no longer going to be a viable tactic. There was an idea of having a number of uncontested cores give you a buff, with the idea of it being sort of like revanchism in Victoria 2, unlike the revanchism in EU4, which is kind of worthless. We definitely need to remove Siberian frontier game mechanics, especially from colonies, because they spread like cancer as it is. We're also going to look into adding a treaty port CB in Wargol, with the idea of allowing wars that are smaller in scope, so we can have more diverse wars rather than every single war being just a conquest war. Abandoning cores causes you to lose prestige right now. We want to flip that around, because if you're so gracious as to give up your core, which is also costing you admin points, then it makes sense that you should get prestige from that rather than lose it. The same thing goes with selling a province. We're going to try and get rid of the prestige loss from that. And finally, we're going to hopefully allow players to sell provinces to rivals, because that whole mechanic really convolutes diplomacy in ways that it doesn't need to be. So again, if you want to see the full discussion, it's about 4 hours long, and there's a link to it in the description. It's the Saturati Let's Fix MP stream. But this is the condensed version of that. Again, I think the most important things are the things that you as an individual can do to make campaigns better for everyone. So thanks for watching, and have a good one.